Well, welcome to the Spring Summit. I'm going to make the sound guy crazy because I'm going to talk in one microphone while I turn the other one on. Sorry, Jim. I want you to consider, first of all, that when we talk about eschatology, you're all sitting there thinking, I know exactly what we're talking about, or you're sitting there thinking, I have no idea what we're talking about. Or maybe your sense of it is somewhere on the spectrum between those 2 points of view. But this is a topic that we tend to come to with kind of a predisposition. We come to it with kind of a way we approach it. So I come from a tradition that doesn't talk a whole lot about eschatology. We kind of approach it from this very humble, we really can't know, we're going to set it over here in a box and keep our hands off it. But at the same time, I spent a number of years worshiping in a tradition that had a lot to say, that had some very determined opinions about eschatology. And so I have to admit that I'm a little bit bifurcated when it comes to this topic, because I have both of these traditions kind of bubbling up in me. One says, we have to detail this. And the other says, why would you want to do that? So I confess that to you so you understand that if you hear some of that in what I say today, you're hearing accurately. I also want to suggest to you that it's a topic that can cause us a great deal of conflict in the church, because some of us don't want to talk about it, and the rest of us have profound opinions. That's never a good mix. So I want to invite you this morning, and in fact for the rest of the summit day, on behalf of the other speakers, to adopt a particular methodology. And it comes to us from the movie The Matrix. Seems like a good place to go when you're talking eschatology. There's a scene in that movie where Neo has been pulled from the Matrix. And Morpheus says this to him, this is your last chance. After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends, you wake up in your bed, and you believe whatever you want to believe. Or you take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Now, some of you arrived at Summit today having taken the blue pill. You're comfortable at home in bed. Maybe some of you are mentally still there. And you're not sure that you want your worldview messed with. You're not sure that these new ideas that Seminary is feeding you are going to fit into that framework you know. And so if you're feeling that today, the topic of eschatology is going to be a challenge, because it's going to stretch and pull at your sense of what is real. On the other hand, if you came in here today and you're a red pill kind of a taker, you already know that this is Wonderland. There's a rabbit hole, and we're not sure how deep it goes. What we do know is that the journey is in the hands of a loving God, and we're confident in that even as we look at all of the questions and the possibilities. So I'm going to encourage you today, if you are normally the blue pill kind of person, take a deep breath, and just for today, try to suspend your pre-existing ideas and commitments and opinions. It's a tough journey. But if you do, I can promise you that you will come out the far end, and either you will know emphatically that the blue pill is where you want to hang out. And I have no argument with that. The world needs people who have that kind of determination and stability in their belief. Or maybe you'll come out the far end and you'll say, you know, the red pill, that was kind of fun. And I think I like questions. And liking questions, that's a very good thing to bring to the seminary experience. It's a lot of what we do. So I want to just really briefly take you on a journey down that rabbit hole. And we're going to spend not a whole lot of time on this first section. It's really just to kind of orient you and get you thinking in that red pill kind of way. And I want to begin by pointing out to you, Jim, next slide, that you are not the only person who has eschatological thoughts. And so just to give you a very general framework, we're going to break it down into two categories, cosmic and personal. Now, when I say cosmic eschatology, I'm talking about questions like what happens at the end of creation, or time, or human history, however you might phrase that. And remember, your mileage may vary here. That language may not be the language you would use. And then the second big broad category, personal eschatology. Professor Conklin, Professor Ebner are going to touch on that later today. That whole question of, well, how does this apply to me? What happens at the end of my life? What does life after life look like? Is there a life after death? And what's my hope in all of that? So two broad categories. And as Christians, we're not alone in using these categories. Jim, next slide. There are, in fact, depending on your terminology, Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Protestant, atheistic, naturalistic, and nihilistic eschatologies, or the lack thereof in some of those cases. So remember that as a Christian, when you say eschatology, you have a very particular category in mind that you mean. But you will find when you go out and do your interview assignment, the person you're interviewing may not be thinking the same thing you're thinking. Or they may hear that word eschatology as right? I don't even know what that word means. And you may have to adjust your language and your thought process. So very briefly, I want to give you just a skimming across the top overview. Think of me as Tom Sawyer, and we're just going to whitewash the fence. We're not worrying about detail. We're not filling in all the cracks. In the Jewish world, there is a very clear sense of cosmic eschatology. There is a world to come, and it focuses around the kingdom of the Messiah. But beyond that, there's not a lot of desire to speculate. And there's a sense as well of a personal eschatology, a belief in a resurrection in some corners of Judaism, and in others, an uncertainty about that. Buddhist eschatology, well, that's kind of a misnomer, isn't it? Because, in fact, it's not an end. There isn't a cosmic eschatology, there's an endless cosmic cycle that's spinning. And individuals are in the midst of that. And it's not so much a belief in a creator, in a theistic eschatology, but a sense that the world is self-perpetuating in some way. There's a personal eschatology embedded in that, in the sense that the human spirit might have an ultimate destination in a possible place called nirvana, but on the same token, each individual life might never attain that. So again, not as much detail as we're used to when we use that word eschatology. Our Muslim brothers and sisters, well, they're people of the book. They come to it with the same background as we do, out of the Abrahamic stories, out of those same root ideas. And so there's a belief in a future last day, in a future day of resurrection. In some corners of the Muslim world, there's a belief in things that sound very familiar. There'll be a period of tribulation, followed by a return of God, followed by judgment, the possible intervention of the prophets, and an end disposition to places that sound much like our Christian heaven and hell. We have much more in common with Muslim eschatology than we might believe. On a personal level, the dead await resurrection in the grave, and there is a kind of immortality of the soul. That should sound a little bit familiar. The Hindu world, well, again, life is a progression, a movement from life to life, and not all of those lives lived necessarily in human form. It's possible that there is an eternal place where the ancestors live, and that one may attain it, but there's a lot of question about how one arrives there. There's also a notion that's completely absent, this notion of a complex end time, a series of events not laid out in detail the way that we tend to in the Christian faith. So at this point, you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, that's very good, but what does that have to do with me and with my Christian faith? Again, all of that by way of saying that what you understand to be normal, the rest of the world may not think is. Do this for me. Take your hands and fold them, if you would, however you normally fold them. Yes? How many of you have your right thumbs on top? Okay. Left thumbs? Thumbs lined up in the middle? That says something about you. Now do this for me. Reverse what you normally do. Oh, awkward. Well, guess what? The other half of the people in the room, because it usually breaks down about 50-50, think that's awkward too. Just because it's something that you are used to as thinking of normal or normative, it doesn't mean everyone else thinks that way. Even within the Christian context, our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, until we get to Vatican II, don't want to talk about this. It's good enough to read the creeds, and the creeds say, well, that there will be an end, a judgment, but that's enough. I don't want to spend too much time dwelling there. After Vatican II, there's a whole new emphasis on eschatology in the Roman Catholic world. It's a much more interesting thing, and there's a new vision of the church that emerges. The church becomes a pilgrim church, a church on a journey towards heaven. And the new emphasis is on concern for the world. Eschatological hope becomes the forefront of the idea. In terms of personal eschatology in the Roman Catholic world, again, a very basic set of ideas. Jesus is the resurrection, therefore he is the model for our resurrection. What we say about Christ, we can say of ourselves. Beyond that, we're speculating. A very definite emphasis on the idea of an intermediary state, somewhere that we go after we die. But after Vatican II, not nearly as much clarity in the Roman Catholic world about what that is. Pre-Vatican II, purgatory. Post-Vatican II, we're thinking about that, and we're not sure that that means what we thought it meant. In Eastern Orthodoxy, well, it's hard to get anyone in the Eastern Orthodox tradition to say much of anything about eschatology. It's not an emphasis. It's not something that they think is an important conversation. When they do talk about it, they talk about it in terms of the Nicene Creed. That is where they point. They believe that there will be a second coming, a judgment, an eternal kingdom, a resurrection of the dead. But for the Eastern Orthodox Church, it's far more important to think of eschatology as something that's woven into the fabric of your life as a believer. And so, for example, we find it blended into their liturgy. The response often in Eastern Orthodox liturgies to the invitation to the communion table, to the Lord's Supper, is, remember me, O Lord, in your kingdom. That meal connected directly to the idea that there is an eternal meal that we eat someday in heaven. Also, a tendency to pray facing east. Any guesses? Why would we pray facing east in the Eastern Orthodox traditions? Facing Jerusalem? Good guess. But in fact, the great ancient fatherland of the church is in the east. And Christ will, of course, return to that place. So yes, facing the direction of the inevitable second coming, so that we never forget that is where our hope lies. The other thing that comes to us out of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and we'll be talking some more about this, is this idea of apokatastasis. That's your 50-cent word for the day. Apokatastasis. The idea of an eternal restoration of all things, including human beings. Now, in Protestant theology, we boil that down into another simpler term. Anybody know it? Universalism. That's an idea that begins to bubble up in the Eastern Orthodox Church as early as Origen. And it bubbles up there because there's this profound sense of a God of love and grace, and the reality that it is inconceivable that Christ could remain sorrowful for lost souls for all of eternity. A modern Eastern Orthodox theologian said love could not bear that, and therefore the church must pray for all. So there's this sense as well of a responsibility in Eastern Orthodoxy. If my brother or sister will not be eternally with God, then I should sorrow over that. And the church should respond out of that sorrow in love. There's a sense as well in Eastern Orthodoxy that there's some kind of a continuity between our earthly bodies and our eternal bodies, but precisely what that is, again, we don't like to speculate. So we believe that as Christ rose and had a body that's had some kind of earthly reality as well as a heavenly reality, in the same way we will as well. And that brings us to mainline Protestantism, where some of you are probably much more comfortable. But again, understand, turn and look at the person sitting at the table next to you. Their mileage may vary. Because things that you think are perfectly normative, particularly when we talk about cosmic eschatology, they may consider to be, well, the same as bunk, drivel. Not an idea that I would ever encourage. One of the things that's always fun when you're in pastoral ministry is following your predecessor into the pulpit. Some of you are giggling. And you discover that sometimes things that you think are perfectly normal, the person who preached before you didn't. And so when the premillennial pastor follows the postmillennial pastor, the unfortunate thing, friends, is that the congregation are sitting in the middle going, wait, that's not what Pastor so-and-so said. Even within Protestant theology, we differ a great deal. Let me ask this dangerous question. How many of you would consider yourselves to be premillennial? Okay. Postmillennial? Amillennial? Not sure what you're talking about. And friends, unfortunately for many, many folks in our churches, that last position, that's the position they're most familiar with. Why? Because we have fed them a diet that is absolutely head-spinning. Turn on the television, pick the evangelist of your choice, watch them for a little while, embed their ideas in your brain, and then change channels. And what happens? Complete cognitive dissonance. So what can we say and what can we agree on? Well, we can agree that Christ will return. We don't, however, agree about the particulars of that. The timing, can't agree on it. Exactly what that means, we struggle with that, but we agree that Christ will return. We agree that that return will result in a resurrection, or resurrections. We believe that there will be a judgment of the living and the dead. Exactly what that means, we don't agree. What that results in, we don't agree. For the most part, we accept that there is a heaven. When it comes to conversations about hell or eternal judgment, well, Now we're back on shaky ground again because we don't agree. Exactly what happens to us at the moment of death? We agree that we die and that some part of us is eternal. But exactly what that looks like? We have questions. We have struggles. And it's important for us to acknowledge that. So today, as we move in a few minutes here into the second half of my lecture, we're going to look at three controversies. We're going to look at three things, three places where we're having trouble agreeing. Universalism, annihilationism, and Christian materialism. And these are ideas that I simply want you to be aware of and able to think about. But before we go there, I want to give you a chance to think a little bit about some of what I've just shared. So I want to give you about 5 minutes, maybe 7 minutes, feeling generous, in your table groups, just to look at that first couple of questions. And the questions I've given you are these. What connections do you see between your own understandings and those of Christians from other theological traditions? So if you have to sit down and talk with somebody whose belief system is different than yours, how will you begin that conversation? And that really is the second question. What possible opportunities for conversation do you see in the eschatological understandings or lack of understandings of those outside the Christian faith? Let me just briefly, Jim, back up 1 second if you can. Touch on atheistic, naturalistic, and nihilistic eschatologies or their lack thereof. Understand that a belief that says there is nothing is an eschatological belief. It is saying something about the future. It's saying something pessimistic about the future, but it is still a belief. It may be a naturalistic belief that says human beings are essentially material animals, so this talk that you Christians engage in about a future beyond that material nature, I don't get that. Or perhaps it's an atheistic belief that says all of this talk about a cosmic eschatology makes no sense to me because I don't begin with belief in God, and you do. Or perhaps it's a nihilistic point of view that says there's no point in even having the conversation because it's all meaningless. So take about 7 minutes in your table groups. Just briefly look at those first couple of questions, if you would. All right, that was the fastest 7 minutes of your life, second only to your driving exam. But I am going to ask you to turn your focus back this way. And obviously, you may have discovered one of two things. Either you and the rest of your table mates can form an independent faith tradition because you all agreed. How many of you found that happened? Or you discovered that there are people sitting next to you who may be heretics. Maybe? And so unless we're going to put around we could send around a sign-up sheet for heresy trials if you think there's anybody who really qualifies. But if nothing else, I want you to understand your point of view, your understanding, your hermeneutic is not going to be the same as every other person you encounter. Does that make the person sitting to your left or your right any less a believer? No. Joel made the comment just now that he thinks it's a good thing that God has a sense of humor. And I believe that God has a sense of humor. I would concur with our dean. Because frankly, I think a lot of the time when we get into these eschatological conversations, God laughs. Because I don't know about the rest of you, but I was given a finite human brain. Try as I can, I am incapable of doing anything with it that is not a function of a finite human brain. I have a finite human intellect and couple it with a fallen nature. So try as I can to understand the mind of God. Inevitably, only God understands the mind of God. And so that really, friends, is the main point I want to get across to you today. But I also want to take you a little further down that rabbit hole I promised you. Jim, next slide. Because the other reality for you, as seminary students, as people involved in leadership and ministry, as pastors, as youth leaders, as worship leaders, is that you are running into ideas that you may or may not have the ability to respond to. So I want to take 3 of those very briefly and unpack them just a little bit. The first of these is universalism, the view that every created person will ultimately be reconciled to God. And on the surface, that sounds like a very positive and benign statement, doesn't it? Who wouldn't want that? And in fact, when we read Scripture, we understand that that is God's desire. John 3:16 and 17. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believed in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. That's God's intent. And so universalism says the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the means by which God destroys sin and death, and thereby guarantees the potential gift of eternal life for all believers. And if God is God, and God is all-powerful, and all-knowing, and all-present, those great omnis, then God cannot fail in God's intention. So if God's intention is that the cross is sufficient, then the cross is sufficient. In general, the argument goes something like this: God is a God of love. How could a God of love allow millions to suffer eternally? So there has to be a plan B. There has to be some way in which all are saved. And we just don't know it. That's the argument in a nutshell. Now, as we respond to that argument, there are some things that we have to unpack a little further. We have to acknowledge that God is a God of love and grace. And God is also a God of law and judgment. And one does not exist without the other. We have to acknowledge that from our perspective, it is not God who condemns an individual to eternal torment. Who condemns an individual to eternal torment? The individual does, by their own actions, by the choices that they make or the choices that they don't make. So the Orthodox Christian perspective, the mainline perspective, the center point of view, says to universalism, it's not that God is not loving. It's that God is loving enough to allow us to choose. Those of you who come from the Arminian perspective, you understand that that free will comes into play. Those of you coming to this from a Calvinist perspective, well, you are going to argue that God is almighty and his grace is irresistible for those whom he has chosen. And the reality is that God loved the world enough to elect those whom he elected. Again, when we respond to universalism, we have to understand that it comes not out of a lack of understanding of the nature of God, but an emphasis on a particular characteristic in the nature of God, the God of love and grace. And it's one of the things that I tend to caution theology students about, is that any time that you hang your hat on a particular attribute of God and you say, this is the sum total of the nature of God, you run the risk of dancing into heresy. Anytime that we overemphasize a particular tradition. The flip side, of course, is that universalism is largely a response to those of us who hung our hats on the peg that says, God is a God of judgment. My first encounter with eschatology was at the age of 3. I got kicked out of Sunday school for asking questions. and sent as my punishment to grown-up church, where my parents sang in the choir, so I had to sit in the front row and be very quiet. And those of you who know me know, did not go well. I don't do very quiet. And so my father made the suggestion that I could read the Bible. And our church had these monster, I was a very little kid, these monster pew Bibles. And they had illustrated pages in them. And so I remember finding Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and being really fascinated by that. And Jesus stilling the storm, I can still kind of mentally see that page. But the one that stuck with me for years was way back in the book of Revelation. And there was a cloud line that divided the page in two. And above the cloud line, there was this big, scary, bearded man on a big, huge gold chair. And he had thunder and lightning kind of bubbling up behind him. And there was an angel with a really big sword. And then down underneath the cloud line, down at the bottom of the page, there were flames and fire. And people writhing in torment. I can still picture those faces. I had nightmares for a couple of years. And I remember going after church carrying the big book to my dad and saying, this picture of this really scary guy. And my dad is a pretty practical, factual kind of guy, and he said, oh, that's God. But Daddy, the people at the bottom of the page aren't happy. And he said, that's what happens when you sin. I was really well behaved for at least a week. But it did kind of create in me this fear. If that's the God who greets me at eternal judgment, I'm in trouble. And it took me a lot of years to understand that that's half the story. That the one who judges me is also the one who loves me, who sought me, who saved me. So understand that universalism comes either out of that deep fear or out of a deep love of God, and both are authentic places. And you may encounter people when you have these interview opportunities who are in that place. And so I want to encourage you not to brush it aside, not to simply say, well, that's a heresy. Get my rubber stamp out. Wouldn't life be easier if we all had heresy stamps on our foreheads? You could identify us in crowds standing next to you. So rather than responding that way, listen. Hear the story. And if you have the opportunity to point out that there's a balance in those understandings, take that opportunity. Lest you think that only heretics and people of questionable intellect end up here, let me point out to you that some of the great universalists have been Gregory of Nyssa, although that one's debatable, William Barclay. If you are reading Barclay's commentaries and quoting them in your papers, you are quoting a universalist, friends. Hans Urs von Balthasar, and others. Our second topic, and again, remember, we're whitewashing fences and we're moving very quickly today. These are all conversations that could take an entire summit. The second of these, annihilationism. Now, if it's God's intention that all should be saved, but some will perish, then we have to posit both a place of eternal reward, we like to call that heaven, and a place of eternal punishment. We tend to call that hell. And some will argue that that doesn't seem to be in keeping with the nature of a loving God. They can accept that perhaps we're judged on the basis of our own actions. That seems to be the witness of Scripture. If you have questions about that, see the parable of the sheep and the goats. The difference between the sheep and the goats? What they do. Folks who are standing at the foot of the throne in the book of Revelation, how are they judged? On the basis of their actions recorded in the great book that's opened. So some Christians will say, yes, I can accept that a God of love and judgment allows us to choose, and our choices lead to eternal reward or eternal punishment. That's not the part that bothers me. The part that bothers me is this. So you're telling me that, well, believers are spending eternity in heaven, in complete communion with God, while that party is going on in the Father's house, out there in the outer darkness. The elder brother doesn't get invited to the feast. In fact, he gets the opposite. He gets complete separation from the Father. And how can the God who loves the prodigal enough to welcome him home not want to welcome the elder brother too? And if he can't welcome the elder brother, surely he doesn't mean for him to be eternally in torment. So perhaps what happens is this. At the end of time, the new heaven and the new earth come, and it says that the old has passed away. So perhaps among the things that pass away is hell itself. God annihilates it. He blows it out. There's still been a judgment and a punishment. Eternal non-existence becomes that eternal punishment. An annihilationist will say, doesn't that seem more in keeping with the nature of a loving God? There's also the question of what is the nature of our souls? If our souls are eternal, and again, that would seem to be the witness of Scripture, how does God unmake them? Can God unmake something that he has made eternal? And an annihilationist will say, well, yes, God is omnipotent and God can do anything God can do. A more cautious theologian will say, God does not do things that are not in keeping with God's nature. And so could God unmake the eternal? Yes. Will God unmake the eternal? Well, a more cautious theologian says, that is beyond my ability to know. Again, the issue here, the reason we wind up talking about annihilationism, is our understanding of God as a God of love and grace. And on one hand, the church has been very clear about this sense of an eternal punishment. You'll find that in the writings of Augustine, Tertullian, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Wesley, Edwards. But the question of what that means, what is eternal punishment, that is one that the church has wrestled with. So John Stott, for example, says, we read texts which speak of the terrible and eternal reality of hell, and in another comment, it seems strange, therefore, if people who are said to suffer destruction are not in fact destroyed. If God's intention is destruction, then wouldn't he destruct that place of eternal torment? Perhaps the most recent and most commonly known annihilationist, can you guess? You know the name? Rob Bell. Rob Bell, writing in Love Wins, takes this journey. He says this, these are strong, shocking images of judgment and separation in which people miss out on eternal rewards and celebrations and opportunities. And yet, Jesus passionately urges us to live like the end is here now today. So love is what God is. Love is why Jesus came. Love is why he continues to save year after year, person after person. For Rob Bell, the questions continue to mount. And if you have read Love Wins, you will find that really Bell is more about the questions than he is about the answers. But he's asking questions that other theologians have asked through the ages. What do we do with this? So an alternative position says that again, hell is the reality because of our actions. And we choose either eternal unity with God, eternal life with God, or we reject that. A friend who says, if you wake up some morning and you discover that you feel as if you are separated from God, ask yourself, who moved? And the answer is always, I did. Because I'm human. Because I have a fallen nature. Because I have a sin tendency. And because I want eternal unity with God. But as Paul says, I'm at war within myself. That which I would not do, I do. The thing I don't want to do is the one I do. So ultimately, annihilation is what we choose for ourselves. We choose that eternal torment. And at the break, my sister over here quoted T.D. Jakes. Will you give us that quote so I don't mangle it?
God has always been good at doing his job. So I'll let God do his job and I'll do mine.
Right? God has always been good at doing his job. So I'm just going to continue to let God do God's job, and I'm going to do mine. The final answer on annihilationism? We'll know in eternity. Again, you may encounter someone for whom this is the normative position. And it's important for you to understand that it is about a desire to see God as a God of love and grace. It's about that 3-year-old kid who opens up that book and sees that picture and spends a lot of years trying to decide, can that God love me? You may encounter those questions as you meet. The last topic we're going to talk about is this question of human nature and personal identity. Let me ask you this question. Who were you in high school? Think way back. For some of you, it's way, way back. Right? In high school, I hung out with the drama kids. That probably tells some of you something about me. My friends tended to be the really smart kids and the really struggling kids. Kind of hung out in both worlds. I didn't hang out with the jocks, even though I was one. I played a bunch of sports. But I didn't kind of like their social world. There were a lot of rules in that world, and I've never been really great about rules. The drama kids, on the other hand, they didn't have rules. And if there were rules, they tended to look at them and go, I can get around that one. That's who I was in high school. Now, part of that is still right here. My husband says the fastest way to get me to do something is to tell me I can't. That's still a piece of me. But a lot of who I was then, it's gone. Some of it's physical, right? I no longer have the ability to smack a slap shot at a hockey net. In fact, the last time I tried to skate, it was bad. My grandson said, Grandma, I thought you knew how to do this. Yeah, Grandma thought she did too. It was a long time ago. Physically, we change. We know that. The older you get, the more aware of that you get. I look in the mirror and my mother looks back. So you're not who you were. The question is, how much of who you were is still there, right? Think back to your very earliest memory. Got it? I promise there's no couch involved. Got your very earliest memory? Do you know the odds are that what you remember is inaccurate? Do you know why? Well, because first of all, you may not actually remember it. I thought for a lot of years that my earliest memory was lying in a crib watching curtains blow in the breeze. And I used to astound my parents by saying, I remember those curtains with the pink and blue bunny rabbits. And they would say, there's no way you could remember that. You were a year old. But I was convinced because there was nothing about that memory that I could have dreamed up from anywhere, right? Imagine my surprise when after my grandmother passed away, I was looking through some old photo albums in her collection, And tucked away in the back, there was a picture of a little baby with red hair lying in a crib with blue and pink curtains. And what I thought was a memory of that picture I probably saw once. So this whole conversation about how much of you is you and how much of what you know do you really know? What's your nature? What's your identity? That's a conversation that makes its way over into eschatology. If we believe that all who die will be resurrected and that they'll have an eternal presence with God, and that's been the affirmation of the church. Either they have a presence eternally with God or in an eternal state of separation, but there is a presence. You will be you. And yet, we also hold that there is this thing called death. How dead is dead? At what moment are you dead? Do you know? Clinically, when is dead dead? CPE students, come on, you know this one, right? Are you dead when your heart stops? Maybe. You might be mostly dead. Because there's the possibility if your heart stops that we could start it again. We do that all the time. Were you dead then? Well, no. That's not dead. Okay, well, so what if my brain stops? What does it mean to have your brain stop working? Well, when they hook up those little electrodes and they look at the screen, instead of they get... Wait a minute. Would it disturb you at all to know that the scale on which they record or is now 100 times finer than it was a decade ago? So a decade ago, the machine would have said, and now the machine says, not quite. Do you know why we have that category of brain death? Well, because people in persistent vegetative states were clogging up nursing homes. And the American Medical Association said, we got to deal with this somehow. We have to have a way to say when dead is. So it's an arbitrary point. It's a line we've drawn. So how much of our existence is tied physically to our bodies? And how much of it is beyond our bodies? If we believe in the eternality of the human being in some sense, then that question of how dead is dead becomes really important. It gets even messier, though. Does your personality have an existence that's connected in any way to your physical being? What do you think? Some of you are nodding yes. A number of years back, my mom had a form of cancer that we thought was breast cancer. We later found out that it had begun as teeny tiny little brain tumors, and that they had begun at least 10 years before there was any indication of breast cancer. And it wasn't until after her death and after the autopsy that revealed that we all went, that explains it. Because my mom, when I was growing up, my mom was a yeller and a thrower. She was just one of those very volatile kind of personalities. She lived big. Somewhere about, well, in her late 40s, she underwent this kind of interesting transformation. She got very, well, gentle and quiet. And that sounds like a good thing, right? Except it was so different than who she'd been that it was kind of weird. You know, we used to kind of wonder, where's Mom gone? And then that became what I can only describe as a kind of religious mania. My mom got to a point where she believed that God spoke directly to her. Now, I'm not suggesting that hearing the voice of God is necessarily religious mania, but trust me, in her case, God said a lot of things I'm pretty sure God never said. And the more time went on, the more it began to feel like the woman who lived in that body, I don't know who she was. She wasn't my mom. And after her death and after finding that reality, we were able to recognize that the physical changes in her body had caused this profound personality shift. My father-in-law had Alzheimer's. And little by little, who he was dwindled away. And the person that lived in that body wasn't anything like who he'd been. So there is a physical reality. Our bodies affect who we are. So if at the moment of our death, our souls and our bodies in some way become disconnected, does that soul continue to be who it was? Or is it now someone else? And when that body is resurrected and the soul, the spirit, the person, the presence, the being returns, is it still the same one? Or is it someone else? So Christian materialism asks that question. It challenges our fundamental beliefs, our sense that who I am right now standing here talking to you, well, someday in eternity, I'll look exactly like the person I am right here today talking to you. Except maybe with better shoes, I don't know. But I don't know that I want to live in eternity in a 47-year-old body. I kind of liked my 20-something body a lot better. How do we know? Those are the kinds of questions that are being asked. The resurrection of the body has to mean in some way that our self and our body are interwoven. But if that's the case, then at that moment of death, whatever death is, then what's happening? Does that mean that somehow my self remains in the grave? Well, that's a question Professor Coughlin will spend a little bit of time with, I would imagine, in his conversations. And so I don't want to steal his thunder. But those are the kinds of questions that we're asking today in theology. So as I said to you at the beginning, I promise I'll take you down the rabbit hole. And I have. Some of you are hoping that you never have to go there again with me. The question remains. If what you've heard today feels too out of the ordinary for you and you can't assimilate it, then maybe you need to take the blue pill and settle back someplace comfortable. And if that is what you intend to do, then please think out your positions and your opinions critically. Make sure that you can defend what you believe. Don't do Scripture the disservice of not being able to correctly explicate it. On the other hand, if you took the red pill and you kind of liked the rabbit hole, don't get so caught up in asking questions that you forget that there are ultimate answers. That ultimately, when we ask the question about eternal states, cosmic and personal eschatology, we really come back to one answer, don't we? That answer is the answer that Dr. Sweeney gave us in the fall. The answer is hope. The answer is our belief in a God of love and judgment who desires to eternally reconcile the world to himself. And beyond that, well, there's a lot of room for questions. That's the red pill piece of the journey. So I want to give you some time now to talk in your tables. Jim, am I right that they can take a break if they need one? And then come 5 to 10 minutes and then come straight back to your tables for discussion, and then you'll be dismissed from there with lunch instructions. Thank you.